But I want to thank everybody for being here and everybody who is supporting this conference. I'm Chris. I'm an engineer turned documentary filmmaker, which is not the usual prescribed career for a Chinese son, but it has allowed me to learn a lot more about the world and about history. And I really appreciated Dr. Chen and Mickey's talk, which reminded me of one of my research trips to Vernon, where I visited a Ukrainian concentration camp, where Canadian government had dispossessed and imprisoned Ukrainians during World War I because they were scapegoats. And this sounds a lot like the scapegoating of Japanese people, which is a lot like the scapegoating of Chinese people today. So I think this really should say something about the challenge that we face and continue to face. We always have to fight from slipping back. Something I really want to acknowledge, though, first, is that I've been really lucky to grow up without being the target of any overt racism in Alberta. I was raised in a white middle class suburban neighborhood, but I didn't feel that being Chinese was a problem, really. And that is a credit to where I grew up, to Alberta, to Canada. And it's also a credit to my parents. They immigrated here and they took on the extraordinary challenge of learning a new language, a new way of life, of relearning their degree in education. And so while I think there's a lot that Canada can do to make that transition a lot easier, my parents managed to adapt, and they adapted so that I could succeed, basically allowing the next generation to. And that's what they always said to me, that, you know, we did this so that you could be successful. And for that, I'm eternally grateful. And Canada was a part of that process. But despite my lack of personal experience with it, there is no doubt in my mind that racism is very real. My son, he's biracial. He's part Chinese and part Sri Lankan, Trinidadian from my wife's side. And I was very conscious of the fact that before he was born, that if he was going to be more white appearing, people are going to treat him differently than if he was brown appearing. The reality is, like, people do judge others by their skin color. Not just white people, but Chinese and brown people also judge other people by skin color. But for me, though, racism only gets at the surface level of injustices that we see. So human beings, in my experience, they're prejudicial, discriminatory towards other human beings about all kinds of things, whether it's someone's appearance, strange cultural practices, whether it's social class, language, or political leanings. So in the case of Mona Wang, was she treated that way because she was Chinese? Was it because she had mental health challenges? Was it because she was a woman? Was it because of the individual police incompetence? Or was a system-wide inability to handle the situation? Or maybe it was all of the above. But in the end, for me, it's like whether it was racism or sexism or ageism, it doesn't matter. It was unjust. And we really need to understand the roots of why it happened and what can be done about it over time. So it's not just about skin color, but about how we treat people who don't fit into the dominant culture, which is the culture that has the power. And that's where that power imbalance becomes a problem. And so I'll share an example of this. I know much less actually about how Chinese Canadians are treated, but much more about Indigenous people. Because for the last 7 years, I've been immersed in the Indigenous culture and history of Canada. I've traveled all over Treaty 6, 7, and 8 territory and filmed with people, a lot of them my friends, from the Blackfoot, Cree, Dene, Nakota, Métis communities. And I can tell you it is a rich history, deeply connected to this land, thousands of years of history. Most Canadians don't have an inkling of this history that made Canada possible. Most Canadians don't know that Canada signed treaties with the First Nations, that they weren't conquered like in many other countries. Many Canadians don't know that the biggest genocide in the world was not the Holocaust, but the settling of North America and South America. And so, Mickey, I really thank you for highlighting this, that genocide is something to know and remember, because we forget that genocide is something that any of us can be a part of, and we have to be on guard for being against that. So Canada has a long way to go, despite our proclaimed values as a multicultural society, but we've proclaimed it, and it is a great aspiration to reach for. Part of the problem, I think, is how superficially we look at the marginalized in our society. we see the levels of addictions on reserve and we blame them for it. Or we bump into a homeless person and we wonder, well, why can't they be successful? You know, like my immigrant parents who came with nothing. And I agree that individuals have a certain amount of choice. But I think what we also forget is that we are all grown from a culture. We didn't come from nothing. So Estonian Nakota friend and I and myself, we made a film together about fatherhood. We really connected because we both had toddlers. We were both trying to figure out how do we raise them in sort of this culture when we both come from two different cultures, and we both wanted to teach our kids the language. But you know, our command of the language is not perfect. And like me, he grew up in these two worlds, and he was trying to navigate that. And he also had caring parents. But that's where a lot of the similarities stop. I accept, and my parents have, that they came here as foreigners to this culture. And so they had to learn that culture. But for him, he was being made to be a foreigner in his own home. This is his home. The indigenous people are from here. They're from nowhere else. And for me, if I wanted to tap into my culture, my culture is preserved, fortunately, by 1.5 billion people in China who are living, breathing it. It's something I'm proud of. It's something I can tap into. But his culture, his Estonian Nakota culture, was destroyed by disease, by residential school, by legislation, by media. And so that is quite different. His language is on life support, but I can literally turn to Siri and ask how to say anything in Chinese. And whereas I grew up in a middle-class home with opportunity at every stage of my life, with generally healthy family and friends, he has grown up in poverty, where his friends have struggled and often died in the process. He was one of the lucky ones. And so in many ways, I feel that my friend has learned much more, come through much more challenges, and he has a strength that I cannot match, except that I started the game of life much further ahead, while he had to start with a deficit. So that is essentially to say is that we can't isolate and judge the person or judge individuals without looking at the history of oppression that came before it. And that's why I think a lot of the speakers here have said that racism is systemic. And so when it's systemic, it's not just about race. It's about health, it's about education, it's about addressing poverty. It's about creating a society where as many people as possible can flourish and contribute to society. What the global pandemic has done, though, is, as Minky has said, it's ripped away the veil, the illusion that all people have these equal opportunities. You know, even like the disturbingly cavalier attitude about, well, it's just old people that are going to die from this. Well, that old people, those are my parents, those are elders, those are my son's caregivers. It's also highlighted how Indigenous and Black communities are disproportionately at risk and disproportionately affected because of pre-existing health conditions. So all of that is to say, as the final word to this, is that yes, we can do better, both individually and as a society, and it'll take time. If not, we do this, if not for compassionate reasons, then for eminently practical ones. We really need as many people as possible to contribute their ideas, to contribute economically, to reach their fullest potential, because I think it would be a total waste to treat people any other way. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Can you see and wave to